We've come to think about capitalism as the opposite to a socialist society. And I know these are very broad definitions, but capitalism involves the distribution of, it involves private economics, businesses, people themselves, owning things and conducting economic activity. And a socialist economy socializes. It has common ownership under the state, which directs and commands very often the means of production and the wealth of the country. They're very broad definitions, but that's what I think people generally would understand as the juxtaposition between both systems.
Mm-hmm. And do you want to talk a little bit more about the capitalism in terms of the relationship between the state and markets, which you've mentioned in previous responses?
What do I think about that?
Well, do you think there's an optimal level of...
Oh yes, I certainly do. I certainly do. I mean, many years ago, 20 years ago, two decades ago, two, and they were then distinguished economists, one of them who has since been in quite an elevated position at the OECD, Tansey and Shoeknecht. They did a terrific book for Cambridge University Press called Public Spending in the 20th Century. And they charted the level of public spending over the 20th century. And these are really fascinating figures. At the end of the 19th century, we saw sort of rough averages in advanced economies of about 11% of GDP. And that would have been the late 19th century. By 2017, so 10 years after the great financial crisis, governments on average spent around 44%. And during that time, they had taken on a number of roles and grown. The big question that Shoeknecht revisited recently in a 2019 study was, or 2020 study was, do citizens get value for money? This was one of the questions he asked. And now he looked at different measures for value for money. And in particular, when we look at charting the public spending ratio over the 20th century, we see that after 1960, when on the whole, public spending was still at around 30% of GDP. After 1960, it rose up to, indeed in some countries, until quite recently, up to 55 or 60, though there were big retrenchments between the 1980s and 2000s in some places. So I find this work very interesting because what Shoeknecht shows, and indeed he and Tansey had already discussed these conclusions, but in looking at other data and measures of satisfaction by citizens, it seems that small governments, about 30 to 35% of GDP spending, give the best satisfaction to people because they concentrate on what Shoeknecht would call the core functions. I've spoken about those earlier. They're about having good institutions, the rule of law, the courts, sound money, stable economies, and good social goods, essential social goods, like ensuring that there is opportunity for good education and good healthcare. So that seems to me to be the optimum size. However, most governments nowadays haven't met the optimum size. In their view, they would be under about 45%. And those over 50%, which are very big centralized government, take a lot. But why this matters is because if government takes an awful lot of your money and your earnings and taxes the wealth countries make, one, in my view, it spends it unwisely unless it's focusing on what it can do. And two, it denudes the economy. It takes the investment out of the economy and hands it to an ill-assorted bunch of politicians and officials to spend on their hobby horses. And that has disastrous effects over time for economic growth and for people's lives and opportunities. And, you know, we've seen what happens to socialized economies. They can't last. Eventually they collapse. We saw how the Soviet Union collapsed, the complete and utter ownership. The only way you can keep these heavily socialized economies together, which do their citizens and citizens' lives down, is by repressive government. And freedom and free markets, in my view, go together and have always been extolled, because in those ways, people making decisions amongst themselves subject to good, sound law, which is executed and implemented and stands, is the best way to give people opportunity to do well in life and to have opportunity. And if government ensures we have decent schools, we can have a debate about how best to provide them, whether we want a continental system, whether we want a US-style system, or what system. But that's a political debate. But we must ensure that there are opportunities for mobility and social mobility. That is extremely important. And for good healthcare, so people can have the best healthcare possible. And how you organize that is a matter of debate.